Hello? How are people today? Hi.
And it's been what since I joined these meets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a bit swamped with the timings, but yeah, how is everything?
It's good. All right. And it looks like Morgan's here. Hello, Morgan. So, yeah, welcome to the new year. And so we took a break, did, holiday things, and now we're back. Yeah, Happy New Year. So, we already actually started off the new year with some meetings. This is the first Saturday morning NeuroSim meeting, but we had a DevoWorm meeting this past week on Monday, the 6th, and then we had a cybernetics meeting on Thursday. So let's go through our DevoWorm materials first. So the first meeting is January 6th. We had actually, in December, the last meeting in December was Susan, and she was talking about her thesis materials. So her thesis is now submitted. Had been talking about that thesis for over a year, and she did a thesis, a master's thesis on biotensegrity for tissue morphogenesis. So she built a bunch of what we call biotensegrity models in a program called COMSOL, which is a multi-physics program, modeled different small models of tissue morphogenesis, and looked at how those motifs of cells, those interactions between cells, is what they call super stable or ultra stable, meaning that you can load them with forces that would normally, say, bring down some structure, but they remain robust to those forces, especially um, things like torsional forces. So this is something she's been working on for a while. She put her thesis out. She actually sent me the thesis to read, so I'm actually going through that. So then this returning to 2025, returning to our meeting schedule, we had talked actually about a paper that was related to that, where they didn't talk about tensegrity per se, but they talked about epithelial cells and doing biophysical modeling. And then we were looking at another paper on cell asymmetry and protein expression, particularly PAR protein expression, and how that sort of contributes to cell lineages as cells divide in an embryo, and how that plays out at this sort of protein level, actually looking at the genes that encode the proteins, and then at the cell level, and looking at how that translates into a lineage tree. So that study was done in C. elegans. So yeah, that's the first meeting of the year. I also, over the holiday, had produced a couple of problem-solving lectures. So this is the first one here. These are short, 15 to 20-minute sessions where I kind of draw things out on a whiteboard. They have to do with a lot of the concepts that we deal with in the DevoWorm meetings. So the first one is this, it's sort of like a chalk talk where I like talk informally and sketch things out on a whiteboard. The first one was about applying game theory to developmental biology. This is called game theoretic development. The DevoWorm group has published a couple of papers on that in that direction. So I kind of went over and summarized some of those materials. And then this other idea called generative divergent integration, which has to do with embryo networks. So we're thinking of embryos as a network of cells that interact, and how in development you get this divergence of function from, say, like, stem cells or developmental cells to differentiated cells that form differentiated tissues that have divergent functions but also maintain sort of a common, get maintained in a common system. So that those are some pretty big ideas, but I wanted to summarize those in about 20 minutes for people. So those are on the DevoWorm YouTube channel as well. So all this stuff can be found in the weekly meeting archive on GitHub, the DevoWorm GitHub organization. So this is, a lot of material here on our past DevoWorm meetings. The link to the YouTube recording, and then usually create a social media post for it as well. Okay, so that's DevoWorm for this week. So we're getting a good start on that. Actually, I wanted to also highlight that last year we had 44 meetings of DevoWorm. So every year, I've kind of count the number of meetings in this archive. I think the year before, in 2023, we had 43 meetings. So we have a lot of content there for DevoWorm. We meet almost every week. And so I think it's worth going back and looking at some of the things that we've done in the past. If you want to, especially if you want to get an idea of how to contribute to DevoWorm, I always get that question: how do I contribute to DevoWorm? How do I contribute to OpenWorm, for that matter? And my answer is, maybe go back to those meetings and look and see what you can find there. I also found this other tool, and I'm not going to pull it up right now, but there's a tool that's out. Mozilla's produced a tool called Orbit, and it's basically a large language model summarizer. So what you can do is, I can't remember what large language model it's built on, but you can plug it into a Firefox browser, and then you can go to, say, like a YouTube video and have it summarize the video. Summarize the video sort of in like a transcript, a text transcript. So it basically takes the audio and summarizes it. So we've talked about that in the past. There are tools that do that you pay for. This is free. And so you can just take that stub and just summarize it and get a good sense of what's going on there. It's not perfect, and it doesn't work for every piece of video and audio content on the web. It just works for YouTube pretty well. So I've been working kind of on that as a side project, thinking about how we can take some of these videos and make transcripts for them, and get at least some more information out of them. Sometimes it's hard to go through the the video and kind of find what you want. Sometimes YouTube will create chapters, sometimes it won't. So coming soon, we'll have some transcripts of these videos so that you can read along and kind of mine those. So that's good. And then, of course, we had our cybernetics meeting, which was on Thursday. It's the first of the year. We talked about this Understanding book by Von Forrester. We talked about the third chapter of that book. So that was on memory, because we've been talking in our cybernetics meetings about memory and memory encoding and memory retrieval. And it was, we have to wrap our heads around it a little bit. But I think it was a pretty interesting chapter. So I think, so we have our cybernetics meetings every 2 weeks. So I think in the next cybernetics meeting, maybe we'll come to the, some sort of next step in that direction. So we might revisit that chapter 3, maybe talk about some other chapters in that book, and or kind of come bring some other readings to the meeting and see. We kind of approach the cybernetics meeting sort of in a free flow way. It's pretty democratic. If someone finds a good paper they want to review, we review that. Otherwise, we kind of continue on a theme. We just kind of follow it out to our satisfaction. So, but if you're interested in joining that, if you go to the Orthogonal Research and Education Lab YouTube channel, you'll find the cybernetics meetings or cybernetics reading group playlist, and you can go and look at some of the meetings we've had in the past. We've reviewed books, we've reviewed articles, we've talked about different topics. So that's good. Okay. So that is our meetings for this past week. I'd also like to bring to our attention two things. We have, I've been kind of putting together a submissions list for this new year and a list of Google Summer of Code projects. And I know we talked about Google Summer of Code projects and how we might proceed on that for this year. So we haven't met on this formally. I think INCF will be soliciting projects soon. I haven't gotten an email about it, but they want to usually have them by the end of January where they can post them. So let's go over those. So our submissions list is pretty sparse right now, but we're only like 11 days into the new year. So we have a number of venues that we want to target, the deadline, and then the event date. So this first example is Embodied Intelligence. I just got an email about Embodied Intelligence 2025. This is an online conference where they cover topics in embodied intelligence. It's a little heavy on soft robotics, but it's always a good venue to present at some of the ideas of our agent-based learning, especially like the things we're doing for vehicles or other types of things. Last year, I presented on developmental neurosimulation, some of the work in that area. This year, I'm trying to maybe do the same thing. The thing about this conference is it's low cost, but also, each person can submit their own submission and do a presentation. So we've had people do presentations in the past on various topics and embodiment. Jesse sometimes presents. They're different. They're pretty broad in terms of what they're looking for. Anything from like philosophy to, like I said, soft robotics, and anything in cognitive science, that has to do with embodiment is usually pretty accepted. So this is coming up. The submission deadline of March 1st for an abstract, and then the event is April 2nd through the 4th. So we'll have to keep that on our radar if you're interested in participating. Kind of think ahead and say what we need to have in place by what date. Another example is the New York Celebration of Women in Computing. This is Jesse's. Jesse's kind of driving this. I don't think there's a virtual component to this, but Jesse always manages to do some sort of hybrid component, and we'll see how that goes. Just contact Jesse if you're interested. This is basically, it's usually some sort of smorgasbord of topics. So I'm not really sure what he's got in mind for this. But if you're interested, contact him. The deadline is passed. I think he's already submitted a deadline or submitted a proposal for a session. And it's just a matter of fitting it into what he wants to do. And then the event will be April 11th through 12th. Then there's MetaScience 2025. This is along with the SIPS virtual conference, an opportunity to engage in like a MetaScience submission. So I view these two as linked somewhat because SIPS is interested in sort of psychological for psychological experiments, for reproducibility, for improving statistical analysis and things like that. And MetaScience is a very similar thing. And the nice thing this year is they're both sort of offering these virtual tracks where you can submit work and present it virtually. And that's a low-cost option to traveling to the venue and presenting there. So I was thinking of having like a common submission here, maybe one tailored more towards, experimental science, psychological science, and another one focused more on sort of the pure meta science. So meta science topics again are things like experimental reproducibility or statistical methods or some other type of thing where you're studying the science of science. So I don't know what we want to do there. I'm kind of thinking about it. The deadlines are coming up soon in February, so that needs to happen within the next month if we're going to do this. And so let's think about that. Let's think about what we want to do for that set of submissions. Ideally, it would be something that we could pivot from one to the other on, so we don't have to like do a huge amount of work. And hopefully it works out. So that's, and then the last thing here is the Google Summer of Code project descriptions. This is a list of project descriptions that I put together. The ones I have are recycled from last year, but updated. And so that is due soon. I know that Morgan discussed, maybe having a project focused on some sort of open source software development for, I guess, NeuroFedora or something like that. Now that's something we should look into. All we need to do is, and I'll show you how these descriptions are written up. Prepare a description, kind of think about what we want to have in the description in terms of like, what's the work that needs to be done, what's the problem that needs to be solved, and then maybe some technical details. So let's go to the list. So this is a list of projects. This I think I have 2 on this list. So yeah, I have DevoGraph and open source community sustainability. So these are 2 projects from, I think these are the 2 projects from last year, and I've updated them accordingly based on the work that was done last year. This first one is DevoGraph, and this is of course where we're trying to build these graph neural network type models and make them relevant to developmental biology. So this is where, of course, we did 2 things last year. We built this sort of neural developmental program where you build this growing network of cells. As the cells divide, you get new nodes in the network, and they get connected based on their position, but they can be connected by means of other things. We just need to train the neural developmental program. We need to train the model with data from our model system, and then we can have these networks that grow, and we can see the dynamics of the network and how they change their connectivity. We can also modify this to work on, building connectomes versus the rest of the cells in the embryo, or some other growth process we might want to replicate. So that's one option for people. And then the other option is to work with these hypergraph representations, which Mehul was working on last year. And I've actually been working on updating the preprint on this over the break. So we'll be having a new version of that out soon, so people can look at that new version and get a sense of what we're doing. Again, this is just kind of building models in different ways. We have the materials in the repository. I've listed some of the repositories and websites they need to get started here. We, have all sorts of training data for this project, so that's something to point people to as well. So we have this basic description here. We have some background reading here. Then we have like a skill level. I would say this is an advanced skill level. You need to have some appreciation for mathematical modeling. You need to understand how to work with data, etc. And then, there's some required skills. So usually we put in there, what are the skills you really need to have down, to work on the project. You don't want to have people who don't know anything about programming, obviously. These are pretty generic skills, but still, it's, there are different skills, and I need to kind of go through here and make sure that I have the skills that I want here. But usually that's part of it as well. There's usually a time commitment. There's a full-time project and a half-time project, so there's like 175-hour time and 350-hour time, and it's just how much work does the project require. I think for something like NeuroFedora would be like a full-time project. This is a full-time project. And, it just depends on what you want them to do. If you want them to do some really deep conceptual work along with the producing a programming artifact, then that's a full-time project. If you just want people to like maintain code or to produce some, programming artifact, then it's maybe half time. But it's really up to you. We need to have a lead mentor, maybe some backup mentors, and I don't have the project website here, but we have links up here. So that's how we kind of describe these projects to contributors, to potential contributors, and get them in the front door. So these will be posted on NeuroStars. People who might want a project will come and look at the description and ask questions. And this description should be good enough for them to get a decent idea of what's going on. And then the tech keywords are going to just kind of describe what kinds of things are involved in the project so that people say, oh yeah, I have an interest in graph theory or computational biology. I should check this project out. So then there's open source community sustainability. We know this project pretty well from last year. This is where we want to, I need to update this even a little bit further because I'm not exactly sure. Well, I think I'm going to leave it open for people as to how they want to really approach this. What I really kind of want is to take what we did last year, the reinforcement learning model and the hybrid agent-based large language model, and keep working on that, developing pieces of that, improving upon it, applying it, whatever. So I want to change this. I really want to make this, though, something that people can kind of make their own and put their own stamp on. So the reinforcement learning models were a good example of that, where we've had like a 3 or 4 year arc now of people doing reinforcement learning models where they've kind of developed one part of it. So we had like kind of the basic reinforcement learning model. We had the multi-agent reinforcement learning model. And then we've tried to expand the reinforcement learning model in different directions. So that's what I'd like to see, kind of like improving upon or expanding one aspect of this community sustainability approach. And since we have the work in repositories, people can go back and add on to that repository. So that's basically it. I have these two parts of this is on the orthogonal lab GitHub, so we have these repository links here that guide people right to the place where the code is. And then, there's some requirements here, which I'm not quite sure I have all of the, I don't really have a programming language requirement here, but I have, basically you have to be able to integrate multiple development environments, extract model representations from complex systems. So how do I think about the problem? How do I abstract it to some sort of programming solution? And then being able to think in an interdisciplinary manner. And those are basically the requirements. And again, the time commitment, the mentors, the project website, which we don't really have, but we have the repositories, and then the tech keywords. So that's the GSOC descriptions. For this year, I'm going to be updating these and keep working on it and getting them ready to go. And they'll probably ask me for them in the next 2 weeks. So if we want to do something with NeuroFedora, we can do that. If we want to do something else, we can do that as well. I'd like to build on, some of the things we've been doing with open source. So in our open source meetings, we've talked about kind of developing these open source sustainability models. We've talked about different, topics in open source. We've talked about research software engineering. We've talked about some of the DevoWorm stuff I mentioned. We've talked about other things. So, I kind of really want to build on some of the things we've been doing there, but maybe some of the things we've been doing later in the year with like programming and project reproducibility, some of the environments for that, some of the tools for that, and maybe even building a, it would be nice to have some sort of interaction with other groups, although we don't need to do that for GSOC. But things that facilitate that. Sarrah wants to say something.
Yeah, I was saying even regarding the open sustainability projects, like the one idea that you have is like keeping it open-ended, like it was for the past couple of years, right? And whatever ideas that the new people may have, so they can either work on the previous ones or add their new ones. Another thing that I maybe wanted to add either in the same this or as a separate this was within the agent hybrid, large language agent hybrid model itself, like maybe improving the environment of that itself. Like, so there were like when I worked on it, there were certain things, certain features that I added. So maybe adding like a new feature itself, like one of the things that was even in my future scope when I was doing the project was trying to add like a RAG based approach, retrieval augmented generation based approach for like how the agents would react to chats. So maybe if we have space, either you can include that as an idea in the description of the open-ended project itself, or like this is just something I want to put out, like that is something that can be done as an improvement on that one. So
Okay.
Yeah, what do you think about it? Like,
yeah, I didn't think about that part about the environment, training environment, I guess, but also kind of like evaluating the environment that the agents are in.
Yeah, evaluating as well as like adding a completely new feature itself to it. Like currently they work on the code part a lot, right? What I worked on, like we have interactions around the coding of issues, but then there were there were also plans to integrate interactions around the communication aspect within the open source community. So like doing that using RAG was one idea, but then of course there can be other ideas as well. But then adding that whole whole feature to the environment. And of course, yeah, as you said, like also evaluating the environment would also be a good one. I don't have any ideas right now as to how that would be possible, but that would also be a good addition, I guess.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Yeah, so that's just kind of constraining people a little bit, based on what we've been doing. So yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, the training, we've explored different ways of doing, like they have these AI gym environments where you train agents, and that's kind of a generic thing. It's not like it's largely like kind of a reinforcement learning oriented thing. But the things we were doing last summer with large language models are good too. Just kind of giving them different scenarios or different, places where they can acquire knowledge. I mean, you can train them on like, existing GitHub issues, but it's like, how do you get them to kind of think, or the agents to kind of think in a way that's based on kind of more situational stimuli?
Right.
Yeah. So that's good. Yeah, we'll have to think about that. I guess just say, we're kind of interested in going in the direction of these kind of training environments, or training, kind of thinking about training the agents.
Okay. So, yeah, and I was also going to say, like, if you're interested, I'll also be interested in being like a mentor for that project itself, for the open source community sustainability one.
All right.
That was possible.
Yeah. What were you thinking about?
So either if there is any addition to the large language model itself, like as I said, like one of the things that like I think could be a project on its own would be like adding to that same framework. Or then also like extending on it, like if anybody has ideas, like when I joined, I had the whole idea of the LLM agents, so I'm sure like there will be some new ideas this year as well. So even those on the entire open source community sustainability part. And then, of course, because of the previous RL work, there will be RL ideas as well. I've not like exactly worked in RL, but I do have like a general idea of it. So even those projects, I think I could like mentor as well. Because like I have a general idea of the open source, the environment that they're supposed to be working in at least. So, and yeah, I think if Shubham is there from last year for the RL one, that would be even better. But like, if there is like no one there right now, then I could definitely like take up mentoring or that as well.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'm looking. Yeah, I'd be welcome. I'd welcome your assistance and help on that in any way you have time for. And I guess it'll become clearer once we get some people applying and get a sense of where we're going with that project. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like I've also been trying to do some of my own work on it as well, but like I'll update you all once I actually get something done. That's been a bit difficult right now. But yeah, once I do have time to get something, I'll hopefully give an update in one of these meetings as well.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. So our timeline on this is, kind of towards, well, the selections are made in early May, so that's usually when we start up our open source meetings again. Now, we'll probably start them up a little bit earlier because we want to have interactions with people before that. And of course, we have other open source activities. I know Morgan and I've been talking about some open source activities outside of our traditional Google Summer of Code stream. But so, I mean, we'll start those meetings up when it makes sense. But looks like Morgan has some things to add.
Just timing. Right, I've got the flu.
Oh, okay.
Feeling better. So apologies, I haven't got back to you about that over the break.
It's okay.
Yeah. It's the holidays were great, but the problem with travel is it's also a time for us all, some good computational modeling of viral infections and things like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, just wanted to say why I'm being quiet.
Oh, that's okay.
And we'll absolutely follow up with you.
Okay.
On these things, but I'm here and I'll try and chime in from time to time. I just got the dogs some food, and we'll try and wake up a little bit before the end here.
Okay. Well, I hope you're feeling better soon. I know it's like this is the time of year, right?
It is. Yeah. Hopefully, hopefully I can be ready for next week.
Right.
Yeah. Listening in and I did have a couple of hypergraph updates or things to contribute to, but
okay.
Just not quite there yet this morning.
Okay. Well, let me know. Yeah.
Okay.
Something that kind of came up in the Slack. It's something that I think I also saw on social media, but I wanted to go through it and kind of show what this was. It's very interesting. So it's this idea of what they call Ludobots. So I think Jesse posted on this in the Slack, and then I saw it independently, and it's this sort of application of embodied intelligence, embodied robotics, where they're sort of building the infrastructure so that people can design their own embodied robots, embodied systems where, this agent has a body, and you can evolve it in different ways. So this is an article from December 2013. It says, beware, scientists are creating machines that can evolve on their own. Or to put it in a nicer way, researchers have found a way for robots to grow on their own. And so this whole work is about basically using something like an evolutionary algorithm or an evolutionary program to evolve robot bodies that match a certain environment, that you can put them in a environment where you can, give different sort of fitness functions depending on what you're interested in, and evolve the shapes of these robots. And then, you might be able to 3D print the body, or you might be able to, run this body in a 3D simulator and see how it behaves in a simple physics environment. So that's the idea. And this is a project that's spearheaded by Josh Bongard. So this builds upon Josh Bongard's work in embodied robotics in what he calls morphological computation. So you can see the robot bodies here. They have legs, they have these panels, and then they're configured in different ways by, say, like a hinge or by some other connector. And that's really the key here, is to develop these modules of body parts and configure them in a certain way so that is to give the robot a certain fitness for its environment. And, that fitness can be assessed in different ways, but basically it's more or less the physics of the environment, but also it can be like something that's performance-based, like, how often it's able to acquire food or how fast it's able to run. So this is kind of this approach, this Evo-Devo-Robo approach, which is evolutionary developmental robotics, which applies principles of natural selection and biological development to machine design. And then he's trying to design these robots that go through growth spurts. Like anxious teenagers, they experience an awkward period of physical development before they find their place in the world. So in these simulations, you'll usually put it in, say, like a physics engine, and then you'll try out different shapes, try to change the size of the phenotype, the size of the different components, and given a controller that is, I guess, static, you can evolve a body, and you have to kind of it's more kind of developing the body, but because you're using an evolutionary algorithm, you're also evolving the body. Hence Evo-Devo, and then the Robo is like because it's a robot body. Okay, so basically you start with this limbless worm-like machine with several body segments. The body segments are these components of the phenotype that change independently and then kind of in a coordinated fashion. And then you try to build this phenotype that can do something that has a fitness imperative. So in this case, you have this limbless worm-like machine with several body segments. That's your starting condition. Then that starting condition has one goal. So it has some sort of goal-directed behavior, which is to make progress across the flat surface towards a light source. So that goal is fixed across the generations of the evolutionary program. And so you're able to evolve a solution to that single task. So it's a very sort of static fitness imperative. It's a very static sort of environment, so it doesn't fluctuate. You just want to be able to create a morphology that can complete the task of moving towards this goal. That's pretty much it. But of course, instead of giving a robot a complete set of instructions, Bongard generates a whole population of bots and lets evolution do the work. So you basically have this population of robots that have different, it has some variation within the population. You introduce mutation, recombination of the representation of that morphology. So you introduce variation. So you might have a robot with 3 segments. You might have a robot with 5 segments. You might start to have robots with limbs. You might have 1 limb. You might have 8 limbs. And the more mutation you introduce, the more recombination you introduce, the more variation you introduce, the more likely it is you'll find some unique solution or maybe multiple unique solutions to this fitness imperative. So you have a population of agents. It could be 100 agents. It could be 1,000 agents. Those agents reproduce, and then those phenotypes are evaluated, and the ones that perform the best get preference in the next generation. And you keep moving like that until you converge upon the best solutions. And the advantage of doing this with an evolutionary algorithm is that the endpoint is somewhat unpredictable. In other words, you might be able to predict, say, maybe the best. You might be able to say, do this in a prospective fashion and say, I could tell you what the best solution to this problem is. Like most engineers, you could just kind of engineer a solution and say, if I want to move towards a light source and a flat surface, this is the design that you need to have. But the thing about evolutionary algorithms is you can actually find unique solutions to this that don't look anything like the prospective or engineered solution. And that's good because sometimes those designs tend to be more robust if you modify the fitness imperative somewhat. So if you say, okay, we no longer want the robot to crawl across a flat surface towards a light source. We want the robot to crawl along an undulated surface or a hilly surface towards a light source. Maybe we tilt the flat surface 45 degrees, meaning that you need to have extra sort of, the robot controller needs to be able to grip the surface more tightly. It needs to have stronger muscles or whatever. And so that may result in a solution that is maybe over-optimized for a flat surface, but works perfectly well on this new inclined surface. Or you might have, variation in the fitness imperative that's captured well in this evolved solution. So this is why we use or want to use evolutionary algorithms for this. So this is kind of talking about some of Banger's previous work. He's found that he can evolve a contraption that walks upright in just 100 generations. So this, there is a criticism of genetic algorithms or evolutionary algorithms that it takes a very long time to evolve solutions. So why don't you just do this prospective engineering? And the answer is, first of all, it doesn't necessarily take a long time to evolve good solutions or good enough solutions. But also that, like what I said, you can evolve solutions that you wouldn't get by just kind of prospective engineering. And so, this is a nice approach. It may take longer, it may not, but it gives you a good answer. So this is one of the advantages of doing this type of work. So Bongard has found that he can evolve a contraption that walks upright in just 100 generations. By contrast, the contraption that starts with legs already formed takes 250 generations. It makes sense to stay close to the ground when you're young and only gradually grow legs and stand upright, which makes you more unstable. So you can actually not only get this solution with respect to the fitness imperative, but you can also have this sort of developmental trajectory that you can see, as you kind of evolve the task or as the solution evolves from the ground state that we talked about, from the sort of the common ancestry that we talked about. And then, you can see these sort of solutions evolve across the generations. You might start with some, legs that are short, and then the legs, as this solution evolves, grow longer, and other parts of the body are modified. So you can actually, with this evolutionary trajectory, get a sense of what maybe you would see in a developmental trajectory. So there is a bit of like conflation here between development and evolution because you're evolving this thing actively. But basically that's I think they're getting some really interesting insights in work like this. And this is why I'm kind of highlighting, one reason why I'm highlighting this, because I think it's a nice method for looking at some of these problems in the development and evolution of behavior, but also in morphologies and the sort of embodied cognition. Okay, so you can also 3D print these robots. We saw that like they have these morphologies that are, have different shapes that are configured in different ways. You can 3D print these, put a little robotic controller within these morphologies, and have a nice robot that has, something that you couldn't necessarily engineer prospectively, but you get these designs and you can test them out in the real world. Another point here, and this is important for what I want to talk about later here, and this story is from 2013. So starting in 2013, he made these experiments available online. He has this platform he calls Ludobots. So the Ludobots platform is basically, Ludo is the Latin for play. And the idea is that you can play with these designs. You can play with the parameters in an evolutionary algorithm. And you can get your own designs that you can then use for whatever you want. So the idea is not so much to help people design things prospectively, but to let them play with the designs to see, given this framework, what can we produce? And because evolutionary programs are generative, if you play around with the parameters, you can get a variety of different solutions and then evaluate those maybe in the real world or in a simulation. So there's a Reddit channel or sub-channel called Our Ludobots. And this is I guess this is a sub-channel, diff design or diff Ludobots, differential design of robots. And so this is some documentation for the Ludobots approach, and this is where, they kind of go through the different components of your Ludobot. You have objects, you have springs, motors, control, optimization, and then final project design. So there are these different tutorials you can follow along that they've listed. The tutorials are all available in, interactive notebooks, so you can fork those and use, play around with the parameters, play around with the outputs, and see what happens. And this is part of a course that Josh created called Education in Evolutionary Robotics. So this is, part of an educational imperative as well. It's not just about design and about teaching people how maybe, how to evolve a phenotype, and then teaching people about the interaction of physics and evolutionary representations. This is about sort of doing this on your own. So there's this strong educational component, the strong sort of DIY component. So Jesse actually, I think, has forked Ludobots on his GitHub. So, he has this kind of marked, and, I kind of wanted him to be here. He could maybe talk about it a little bit, but that's okay. I think I know now that he's interested in this. So we might actually pursue this later as sort of a side project or something that fits into our educational mission, because I think the materials are already there. We can much more easily do things with it. This is the Diff's Bespoke Morpho repository. So this is where you have this repository where we have a mass spring body model, and we have an interactive notebook that allows us to run through this sort of model and build like what they call a mass spring model. So there's this history of mass spring models being animated online. So there was a project about 25 years ago called Soda Play. And this used to be a Java applet that you could run in your browser. You could, design these little mass spring models, which means that you have these little masses that you would put in space, and then you connect them with springs. So you have these little like skeletal structures. And then, you could build as complex as you wanted. And then you turn on a physics engine where these mass spring models would exist in a physics engine. You could play with the parameters of the physics engine and you would maybe move it, you pick it up, and you drop it on the ground in the physics simulator, and then the thing would move around, and it would have different dynamics. Sometimes you could get them to walk. Sometimes you could get them to just kind of bounce around. And, it's just really fascinating stuff. A lot of that work goes back even further to passive dynamic walker research. And was started by Tad McGeer, who's a mechanical engineer. And they actually were able to build these robots that could sort of, if you put some input energy in, they could reproduce bipedal motion, bipedal walking. And so, you can take mechanical systems without a brain, you can put some initial energy into them, and they can move in a way that looks like it's controlled by a nervous system, but it's actually not controlled by a nervous system. It's just controlled by the interactions between the form, the geometry of the form, and the physics. So this repo has some mass spring body simulations in it, and some of the things that you need to run those. This is actually the Colab notebook. Now, you can run this notebook and produce a movie, which I'll show you in a minute. I'm not crazy about it. Like, it seems like you're passing a lot of these things in and out of a black box, because what you're doing is you're cloning this bespoke morpho repository, and you're putting in, some parameter values, and I can't really follow from this code exactly what's happening with the mass spring simulation. But you can basically set it up so that you can export. This is the reason this notebook exists, is because this is part of just building a bot and putting a video together to show you the outcome. So this is more of an educational thing. So that is like passing parameter values into a black box, and there's probably some lower level code that we can revisit. I'm not going to do that here. But what you end up with from this notebook is this video. So basically outputs this video where you have these mass spring models. You see the masses here, the springs linking them. And it's in this physics simulator where this is the floor here, this black bar, and it's kind of bouncing up against the wall. So it's, you're moving it, it's kind of reacting to barriers, reacting to the physics. If you make the gravity really strong, you can get these things to collapse. If you make the gravity really light, you can get these things to float. But you can see that they're reactive in a lot of ways. So they have this motion that looks like it's controlled maybe by a nervous system, but there's no nervous system, it's just springs and masses. And so the idea is that, everyone can kind of produce their own, I guess this is just kind of a demo to show what these look like. And, everyone can kind of produce their own version of this. And, it's educational at the very least. This is from the communications of the ACM. This is this article by Josh Bongard, Evolutionary Robotics, where he kind of advocates for this approach. And so he talks about how to design, construct, and deploy autonomous and adaptive machines. And so people have been trying to approach this for years and using this prospective engineering approach.
Sorry, what's the article? He's got many articles. This is from ACM?
Yeah, this is from
okay.
ACM from August of 2013. So this is all kind of from 10 years ago, yeah. But this is, he's been doing this for quite a while. So, yeah, and then we have industrial robots are an example of autonomous yet non-adaptive machines. They execute the same sequence of actions repeatedly. Conversely, unmanned drones are an example of adaptive yet non-autonomous machines. They exhibit the adaptive capabilities of their remote human operators, but they're not autonomous. So they're controlled by another agent that is, can adapt to different conditions. But, you can't you have to have a human in the loop. To date, the only force known to be capable of producing fully autonomous as well as adaptive machines is biological evolution. So then we talk about like how we can use these population-based meta-heuristics, evolutionary algorithms, to optimize some or all aspects of an autonomous robot. The use of meta-heuristics sets a subfield of robotics apart in the mainstream of robotics research, in which machine learning algorithms are used to optimize the control policy, which is defined as some function that transforms a robot sensor signal into commands sent to its motors. So the idea that you want to be able to optimize how it's moving, how it's taking the sensor signals and creating a set of motor commands, and that is kind of the goal of this. As in other branches of computer science, the use of a meta-heuristic algorithm is a cost and a benefit. The cost is that it's not possible to guarantee if or when an optimal control policy will be found for a given robot. The benefit is that few assumptions must be made about the problem. Evolutionary algorithms can improve both the parameters and the architecture of the robot's control policy and even the shape of the robot itself. So we're talking about sort of the goal that we want to achieve in the control policy. That control policy could be in the form of say a neural network or some controller, but it's also in the form of this morphology. And so the morphology can constrain the behavior generated by the controller, or it can benefit that behavior of the controller, depending on how adapted it is to its environment. So that's basically, and so they're approaching this from a fundamentally different way than traditional sort of artificial intelligence-driven robotics, which means that they're considering explicitly the design or the sort of the form of the phenotype that is involved in behaving. So if you need to move towards a light source, you have to consider the types of locomotion you may need to use to do that. Some types of locomotion are better than others. Conversely, you can't just plug a controller into any generic morphology. You have to use a specific morphology that is kind of coupled to this control policy that you're using for the behavior. So there may be solutions that are very unique in terms of the phenotype or the shape of the robot that have a correspondingly really interesting and maybe non-optimized for anything else behavioral policy. So that's kind of where we're going with this. So to illustrate the distinction between mainstream and evolutionary robotics, consider two experiments drawn from two fields. So you have leg locomotion, which is optimizing control policy that allows for a 2 or 6-legged robot to move over rugged terrain. This is a popular area of study in robotics. So this is where we want to sort of control, you have a sort of a fixed set of phenotypes and then optimize the control policy for those phenotypes. In mainstream robotics, machine learning algorithms can now optimize walking behavior for a physical 2-legged robot in a matter of minutes. So this is a trivial problem if you have sort of a fixed morphology. But of course, it also requires very little variation in the environment. So if you're wanting your 2-legged robot to move over rugged terrain, you can do that. You can program a controller. If there's some variation in that task for some reason, if you switch to a smooth terrain or an incline or something else, then it's a little bit harder for that program to work correctly. But anyways, that's the approach you use in mainstream robotics. Alternatively, a recent investigation in simulation has shown if robots are evolved to move over rough terrain, robots will eventually evolve from amorphous shapes into robots exhibiting the rudiments of appendages. So this is where they're simulating these robots in this environment these environments that Josh Bongard has been working on. If you have robots that are evolved to move over rough terrain, if they have these adaptations, these specializations for this type of environment, Robots will eventually evolve from amorphous shapes into robots exhibiting the rudiments of appendages. So the appendages are sort of giving it this extra fitness. So not just having things like blobs or sets of boxes, but to have appendages that can actually sort of dig into the terrain and, move independently, semi-independently of the body. So this is, this is kind of showing the power of doing these kind of experiments. And so, this is a figure that shows a sampling of representative work in evolutionary robotics. So this is where you have different ways of approaching evolutionary robotics. This article is intended, I think, to be like a review of evolutionary robotics, but really laying out the practical imperative of the field. So what I talked about was the sort of the practical imperative. This is sort of the ways in which people have approached this and build. And you notice that these models are pretty simplistic. The robots, they don't look too much like animals, say. I mean, this soft robot kind of does. It looks like some sort of worm. But otherwise, they look like robots. So, but in any case, this is, I guess, a good starting point. But there are different ways that you can generate, robotic morphologies and tie those to control strategies and so forth. So evolutionary robotics often involves optimizing not only the controller of a robot, but also its body plan. Formal grammars, this is this A example from Hornby and Pollock, and algorithms that simulate development, which is this B from Ackerbach and Bongard, have been used to optimize robots in simulation. So this is where we have a formal grammar that we use to construct a robot. So robot morphology is a product of a grammar and sort of composing that grammar in different ways. So each part of the morphology is attached to sort of a set of grammatical rules, and you build it that way. Or you can use a sort of a developmental approach, which I described earlier, where it's a different type of way of approaching the problem. You still have this sort of compositional aspect, but it's a fundamentally different way to approach the problem. You can use both of these, however, to optimize robots in simulation. Additive manufacturing has been employed to build physical versions of evolved simulated robots semi-automatically, and that's examples from C and D. These are these two examples. This is the Golem project. This is by Lipson and Pollock, and showing how they've done this. So they basically did this additive manufacturing, and once deployed as physical machines, evolutionary algorithms have been used to allow damaged robots to recover from injury. That's the example in E. So basically, you can use evolutionary algorithms to fix a damaged robot or to sort of infer the way to repair it. That was from this Bongard et al. Article here. As well as ease the transfer of newly evolved controllers from simulation to the physical robot. That's his F here. So you can do all sorts. You can do task transference or functional transference. You can do repair. You can do all these things that we think of, we maybe associate with natural intelligence or life. And again, the metaphor is stretched here, but that's where they're kind of going with this. And then, of course, in the case of a robot, you have very practical imperatives for these things. You want to be able to fix things in real time. You want to be able to do transfer of learning, test transfer across contexts. And so all these things are very important to the practical concerns of robotics. In addition to locomotion, researchers have evolved more cognitively demanding behaviors, such as discriminating between differently shaped objects by manipulating them, which is shown in G, where they have this hand that's controlling a basketball, or physically demanding tasks like aerial swarming, which is H. Behaviors have also been evolved for robots with non-traditional body plans, such as tensegrity robots, this is a tensegrity structure. This is going back to the stuff that Susan is doing in DevoWorm, where she's thinking about these kind of tensegrity structures, which are these ultra-stable structures. And you can use them for a wide variety of things. Actually, tensegrity originated in architecture, and you can use them to design robots that are ultra-stable. So if you load one end with forces, or you load a number of ends with forces, this structure exists in dynamic tension, so it can experience a wider range of forces than some other structure that isn't a tensegrity structure. So without getting into the technical details of this, suffice it to say that these are really desirable for building robots. We can also use it to explain like large scale structures in cell biology and development. So that's why this is a really interesting sort of direction. And it's interesting that we can evolve these kind of tensegrity structures, in particular tensegrity robots. So these tensegrity robots actually have behaviors associated with them. So the structure is behaving in the world. It's not just experiencing loads. It's actually moving and doing things, which is really interesting from the standpoint of how we're doing things in biology, how we build these tensegrity structures that are maybe kind of static, and then thinking about how, say, cells migrate together and maintain these tensegrity structures. So tensegrity robots, soft robots, which is J. So John Reifel has built these soft robots that are, programmable. Really interesting area of research. These look more like animals, like I said. So maybe one of the goals of evolutionary robotics is to get close to replicating some simple animal morphology, but simple animal behaviors. Modular robots and robot swarms. So modular robots are these here, where you have just different components that are sort of coordinated, and then robot swarms here, where you have different robots that are coordinated. So that's the imperative of evolutionary robotics. I think there's another set of words here on tensegrity structures. So advances in material science, however, have made non-traditional robot body plans possible. Is one example, the evolution of behaviors for tensegrity robots was reported in Paul, and that's reference 26. Tensegrity structures are collections of rigid and elastic links attached in a particular way that provides several advantages over traditional robots, such as the ability to automatically revert to their default form if perturbed, so they can recover from these perturbations that might be very disastrous otherwise. So there's a lot to think about there in that area. And then there are a lot of things going on here with respect to morphological computation, information theory, and dynamical systems theory. So this kind of lends us to some of the topics in embodied cognition and embodied intelligence. So as usual, there are the usual challenges here. And this statement here, one goal in evolutionary robotics in particular, and in the field of evolutionary computation more generally, is to create increasingly evolvable algorithms. And by evolvable, it just simply means how much variety can you produce from these, from a single algorithm? How expressive is that algorithm with respect to the range of phenotypes that you can achieve? So if you build an evolutionary algorithm that has very little expressivity, that means that you're not really going to be able to take advantage of the generative nature of evolutionary algorithms, or the combinatorial nature of the algorithms. So, putting them in different environments, evolving them for many generations doesn't really get you anywhere. So you have to make sure that you can have these evolvable algorithms and create increasingly evolvable algorithms to help you to kind of come up with these unique solutions that you want. Yeah, so this is another point here. One goal in evolutionary robotics in particular, in the field of evolutionary computation in general, is to create increasingly evolvable algorithms rather than independently optimizing the individual parameters of a candidate solution. Such algorithms should rapidly discover useful aggregate patterns in candidate solutions and subsequently elaborate them. It has been shown, for example, that genomes that encode formal grammars produce robots of regular structure, and that such genomes are more evolvable than genomes that do not produce regular structures. So that means that if you have a representation of the problem, and in genetic algorithms, we usually encode this in terms of binary strings, and those binary strings are combined together in a genome. If we structure those representations in a certain way, which have this sort of grammatical structure, we're able to sort of make our algorithm maybe more expressive or more evolvable than if we didn't do that. So, there's a problem of representing things in this form of a artificial genome or artificial chromosome, but also the problem of structuring this representation in a way that can then be expressed. And formal grammars are sort of the way to go there. So there are a lot of different ways we can improve our representation, improve how, our fitness function, improve some of the aspects of this approach. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting references here. And a lot of them have to do with sort of this. So this one here, 26, design and control tensegrity robots for locomotion. That's again an interesting article. There's this book, Pfeiffer and Bongard, which we've talked about before, how the body shapes the way we think. There are a number of other articles on information theory and soft robots as well.
Love the community that he's got there.
Yeah.
I've watched it over the years. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
The ECM article you were sharing, that was the diff Ludobots one?
Yeah. Oh, which one is that?
Oh, no. You had an ACM article?
Oh, I don't think I have the link for that. But that's that article is. Let me see if I can get the information.
Is that what you mentioned?
Yeah. So that's the in the August 2013 issue of ACM.
I wasn't. Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's already. It's very much. He has all his evolutionary robotics courses and lectures and materials online. You can tell when he starts a new semester because he's like it's online immediately.
Yeah.
It's absolutely ready to go educationally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's great stuff.
Yeah, it is. All right.
So,
go ahead.
yeah, like when you were explaining about the evolutionary robotics one, like it reminded me a lot of like how genetic algorithms also work.
Yeah.
And like I think like genetic algorithms are like a subclass of evolutionary algorithms itself.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was interesting. So I was looking to like read up on that. So I think I'll just what was the name that Morgan mentioned? Who works on it?
Oh, this is Josh Bongard, and of course there are other people who do things on this.
Yeah. Yeah, but Josh has like all his courseware, or like his lectures come out almost immediately on YouTube when he starts a new semester, which is awesome.
Yeah, got those. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, so that's great. yeah, speaking of our sort of putting things on YouTube, Morgan's put a lot of things from YouTube in our Slack channels, and so if you're interested in looking at different lectures and things like that, we always have stuff kind of in our Slack channels that are, kind of things that from different conferences. There's a lot of content on YouTube. If you're interested in any topic from an academic standpoint, we can always find some really interesting stuff. Conferences are always putting things on YouTube. Now, of course, with Slack, we've got this limitation of like the 3-month window where things get kind of disappear on us. I've been trying to make backups of that, and I've been also offloading things to our different Discord servers. So I'm going to try to make more of a point in the new year to review those things to make sure that we have, we know kind of where these things are so they don't get lost. So that's, and then of course, synthesizing a lot of that stuff. So like at the last meeting of the year, last Saturday morning, NeuroSim, I talked a little bit about computational psychiatry and kind of developing an overview of what we've been putting in the channels. So that I still want to move that forward this year. And I don't know what we might do with that. If we might do like a review article, or like, I don't know, maybe it's better served as like a interactive survey where you can say these are the topics that are interesting in evolution or in computational psychiatry. Here are some links. Having this in a more formal setting, like a web repository or something. Maybe having a short paper accompanying it, like a preprint. I don't know how we would do that, but that's something we should try to do, because it's like, we have these interesting conversations about this stuff, and I want to see if we can maybe make it into like more of an educational community.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I just had a conversation like a week ago with a upcoming student, and covered a lot of this computational psychiatric like material, and and he felt that it was all very new, all very like seeing it all together in one place was really helpful, and it makes me think that maybe there is a kind of a place for that, some additional kind of popularization of computational psychiatry. What was it? Nicole Rust has as a New Year's resolution. The University of Pennsylvania professor has New Year's resolution for all scientists: do more psychoms this year.
Oh yeah.
She felt that was good to challenge any incoming anti-science bias that was, yeah. So that sounds like a great New Year's resolution for the lab.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, but yeah, there's a lot of, and then again with a lot of these newer fields, there's always this sort of mass of stuff that comes out, and there's always this need to sort through it. Like, you have people doing a lot of work. Right? Thank you, Sarrah. And then you have people doing all this great work, but there's really no synthesis. That we need synthesis, really, I think, to make sense of what's going on. So it's a very important step in the thing, but I don't know if it's science communication. Some of it is, but some of it is, even like theory building or other things like that. So I think there's always a role for like, what we're doing is really interesting, and I think it's not like it's serving a need, and we need to kind of figure out what that niche is more directly, I think, because we've been kind of populating that niche somewhat, but not enough. And we can't compete with other groups that are doing like state-of-the-art science. And that's, not for every group. Some groups, they're better at kind of, addressing the open questions that result from the cutting edge science, maybe more so than doing the cutting edge science. So, yeah. I have these two readings and I think they're really interesting, and I'm not sure how they fit together. Topic is called Spontaneous Activity and Intentional Behavior. One paper is on what they call the accumulator model, and we'll figure out what that is when we go through the article. And the other article was on active inference and intentional behavior. So let's get into this topic. This is the first paper. This is by Aaron Schurger, Jacobo Stitt, and Stanislas Dehaene. This is from PNAS. I think it was from 2012, so it's been a while since this has been out. But this paper is called An Accumulator Model for Spontaneous Neural Activity Prior to Self-Initiated Movement. So if you're familiar with the readiness potential, which precedes voluntary self-initiated movements, that's what they're referring to. And so they're, usually when you move your arm to a target location, your premotor cortex generates this readiness potential, which is, sort of dates the movement itself. Before the movement is initiated in the body, it's initiated in the brain, and then that signal is initiated somehow. So it's basically spontaneous neural activity, but it translates into the self-initiated movement. That's basically the problem. And so this, if you are familiar with the Libet experiment, or, and they use this experiment to sort of talk about free will. It's this idea that you have this motor planning phase before you actually have the motor execution. And so then people say, well, does that mean that we don't have free will because we have these things in the brain that happen before the actual movement? And you could make that argument, but it's, ignoring, of course, that your brain is not, that your brain isn't this sort of autonomous thing, that your brain is linked to what the body is doing, and then it's linked to things that have happened before, and all this other stuff. So this is an interesting topic. And what they're going to talk about here is this sort of buildup and understanding what's going on here. So this is, of course, neural activity, and we usually measure it with some sort of EEG. And we're going to talk about what this model is computationally, and what we can understand about it. And then we'll move into the other paper. So let's start with the abstract. So we start out by saying a gradual buildup of neuronal activity known as the readiness potential, which is going to be this signal in brain activity. It's going to be like something you can measure electrophysiologically. Reliably precedes voluntary self-initiated movements, and the average time lock to movement onset. So this is where, this happens before movement, it triggers movement, and it's a buildup of this signal, or this neural activity. This buildup is presumed to reflect the final stages of planning and preparation for movement. So again, there's this planning and preparation that happens, and you don't think about it consciously. It's a subconscious type of planning. Obviously, if you say, for example, see something on a table you want, and you want to move your arm, you have that sort of from another part of your brain where you see something, there's a motivation, and then you want to make a movement, but you don't just make the movement. There has to be some planning on making the movement, on moving things. And so, this is something that happens very quickly, but there is this planning and preparation, and then this signal that's generated. Here we present a different interpretation of the pre-movement buildup. We use a leaky stochastic accumulator to model the neural decision of when to move in a task where there is no specific temporal cue. So in this case, what we're doing is we don't see anything sort of in the environment. There's just kind of this neural decision that's made through this model of a leaky stochastic accumulator. Basically, where you get the signal it's accumulating and it's leaky with respect to how much is stored, and then there's a stochastic component, which means that the accumulation is stochastic. So this is just kind of maybe generating the signal spontaneously. But only a general imperative to produce a movement after an unspecified delay in the order of several seconds. So the idea isn't that you're motivated by, the model isn't motivated by any specific thing in the environment. It's sort of like this autonomous thing that's activating. So it's like there's a need to make a movement. We don't know what it's in response to. It's just making this signal. It's just hitting above threshold, basically. According to our model, when the imperative to produce a movement is weak, so this is where, it's not Q-driven, but it's like there's an imperative to produce a movement. In other words, we could say, like, you must move so many, or you must produce a movement signal so many times in a minute. Or, it might be so many times in an hour. The imperative changes as the need to produce a movement changes. And again, this isn't in response to any sort of stimulus. It's just like an autonomous model that's just generating movement. So in this model, when the imperative to produce a movement is weak, the precise moment at which the decision threshold is crossed, leading to movement, is largely determined by spontaneous subthreshold fluctuations in neuronal activity. So what that means is that basically movement is determined by the sort of these subthreshold fluctuations, and so the movement is spontaneous, the movement signal is spontaneous, it's generating spontaneous movements. So that's the part here. Time locking to movement onset ensures that these fluctuations appear in the average as a gradual exponential looking increase in neuronal activity. So this is where it's linked to movement onset. Our model accounts for the behavioral and electroencephalography data recorded from human subjects performing the task, and also makes a specific prediction that we confirmed in a second electroencephalography experiment. So this is EEG. Fast responses to temporally unpredictable interruptions should be preceded by a slow negative going voltage deflection, beginning well before the interruption itself, even when the subject was not preparing to move at that particular moment. So this is, again, where they're introducing interruptions. They have these fast responses, and those can, so this has an effect on how movement preparations are executed. So this readiness potential is something that has a German name, of course. It's interesting. So let's see. Let's go to this part of the paper here where they talk about the initiation of spontaneous, uncued movements. This raises some unique questions. If there is no external signal to trigger the movement, then what is in the brain is responsible for triggering the movement, and how is the precise time of onset determined? So this is the question they're trying to ask with some of the things that they're doing with their model. So again, you can have like a sort of a naturalistic setting where you move in response to stimuli in the environment. But what if there's no external signal to trigger the movement? Then the brain has to autonomously trigger the movement. So, you might think like, instead of having a stimulus in the environment, you might think, gee, maybe I should, like if you're in a dark room and you can't really see anything, and you think, gee, maybe I should put my hand out and feel where I'm going because I can't see anything. I mean, that's one example of what they're talking about. This would be a mental sort of trigger, but still, or, you could have a spontaneous trigger, maybe a reflexive trigger where you're not seeing anything, so you reach out and you try to feel the walls around you to see if there are any barriers or obstacles in your way. So these are the kinds of things, but the brain still has to trigger these, and it's going to be a different mechanism. So this has to be timed properly, because if it's something that is, like, say, a reflexive response or something, then it can't just be kind of uncoordinated in terms of time. So these questions have been raised in the past, but the possible role of ongoing spontaneous neural activity has not been considered. And then they talk about the readiness potential here. So they talk about how you can record this from EEG. Discovered in 1965 by Kornhuber and Dicke. The RP appears in the average over many data epochs, time locked to movement onset. It may begin its negative deflection 1 full second or more before movement onset, depending on different aspects of the task and methods measuring this and so forth. Readiness potential is taken to be the electrophysiological sign of planning, preparation, and initiation of volitional acts, echoing the widely held assumption that gradual increases in firing rate and electrical potential that precede spontaneous movements does in fact reflect the goal-directed operations that cause those movements. So one thing we kind of take RP to be, readiness potential, is this sort of expression of this gradual increase in firing rate that precedes spontaneous movements, and that is sort of something that's linked to goal-directed movements. So surprisingly, more than 40 years after the discovery of the readiness potential, this assumption has only recently been questioned. And so this is where the pre-movement buildup of neuronal activity apparent in the readiness potential and the assumption of causality invested in it have become a cornerstone in the study of volition. So originally people thought, okay, this is a movement. This is, this precedes movement. This is sort of goal-directed exclusively. And, we don't really think too much about the causality or cases in which maybe it's not involved in goal-directed movement. So Benjamin Libet, of course, did these experiments where he tried to measure the temporal relationship between the onset of the readiness potential and the feeling of an urge to move. And this is, of course, a pretty hard thing to measure. I mean, you can say, you can kind of link intentionality to the readiness potential, but it's hard to kind of get the sense of what constitutes motivation here. But in any case, decoupling this is a very important step in really understanding what the readiness potential does and how it operates. The result of Libet et al.'s experiments suggested that the objective neural events of the brain that cause movement precede the urge to move by 300 milliseconds or more. So there's a report of an urge to move, or there's an urge to move, which I guess is the production of the movement, and then the readiness potential, which precedes it. So from a causality standpoint, this presents somewhat of a problem. A recent experiment using Libet's paradigm confirms the same pre-urge buildup at the single neuron level. So before you get this urge, you get this buildup of signal. Such demonstrations have had an unrivaled influence on the prevailing view that movement is initiated preconsciously, and the feeling of intending to move is grafted on after the fact. So this is interesting that there's this decoupling between the two, between the pre-movement signal and the urge to move or the movement itself. And, understanding that causality, while important, is not at all clear necessarily. In fact, a gradual increase in neural activity preceding spontaneous movements appears to be a very general phenomenon, common to both vertebrates and invertebrates. Why do humans and crayfish, in this citation 18, exhibit the same 1 to 2 second buildup of neural activity in advance of self-initiated movements? So, you see this not only in humans and in motor cortex of humans, but in crayfishes who don't have the same neural structure as humans, but nevertheless have the same buildup of neural activity where it's being generated in crayfish. So we have this same phenomenon. Kornhuber and Dicke's interpretation of the readiness potential as a sign of planning and preparation for movement fails to explain what specific neural operations underlie the spontaneous self-initiation of movement and why these operations are reflected in the specific exponential shape of the readiness potential. So the shape of this signal is actually important as well. Here we present a very different interpretation of the mounting neural activity preceding spontaneous movements made in the context of a spontaneous movement production task. Their model that they use this spontaneous signal shows that a decision threshold applied to autocorrelated noise, in this case the output of a leaky stochastic accumulator. So this is where you have this autocorrelated noise in this form of a formal generator, can account for the specific shape of the readiness potential as well as the distribution of waiting times from subjects performing Libet's spontaneous movement task. We replicated the Libet experiment, behavioral and EEG results, and validated our model by fitting the shape of the readiness potential using parameters chosen by fitting the behavioral data. In addition, our model also directed us to a specific prediction that we tested with the second EEG experiment. So they kind of talk about these two paradigms. There's the Kornhaber-Indica paradigm, and there's the Libet paradigm. These two paradigms are different in important ways, although both reveal a readiness potential when the data are time-locked to movement onset or onset of EMG activity. So EMG activity being the muscles and how that signal moves to the muscles, which of course is consistent with the limb movement, and so in movement onset as well. So in the Kornhaber-Indica paradigm or K&D paradigm, subjects produce self-paced movements at irregular intervals for periods of a few minutes at a time. Subjects are explicitly asked to avoid making rhythmic movements and to vary the intervals between movements. So these are just kind of random movements. They want to randomize the movements and kind of make sure that they're not part of, that there isn't this sort of movement arc or this sort of, they want to basically decouple sort of movements from their preparations. In studies that have used the K&D paradigm, subjects are typically told to keep the intervals within certain limits. For example, you might have someone pause at least 15 seconds between movements, but not more than about 25 seconds. And so there's this interval that we need to keep that, again, you have to ask subjects to do something to control their behavior and time themselves. And that can be, that can be problematic. But anyways, the K&D paradigm often includes a time interval approximation task, and therefore processes of time estimation may be confounded with those specifically involved in self-initiation of movement. So you have this, a lot of this is sort of self-report based or self-regulation based, and it's hard to measure is the bottom line. And so both motor timing and time estimation tasks have been associated with activation in some of the very same regions that are associated with self-initiated or self-paced movement, notably the supplementary motor cortex or SMA and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or DLPFC. So these are, so this is where you get this sort of, these time estimation tasks and the motor tasks are in the same place. So, it's kind of, again, it may be a confound in some of these experiments. And it just goes to show you that this isn't a very easy thing to interpret. In the Libet task, which we adopted here, subjects do not repeatedly perform a movement at irregular intervals as in the K&D task. Instead, there are discrete trials with exactly one movement per trial. Once the trial begins, there is a minimum waiting interval of 3 seconds, and then the subject may make the instructed movement spontaneously at any time. Subjects are specifically instructed to not target a particular time interval or pre-plan the time of their movement in any way. After the movement is made, the subject recalls the approximate position of the clock dial, which is shown to show the waiting time. At the moment he or she first was aware of the urge to move. So this is kind of like you kind of look at a clock, then you can make a spontaneous movement, and then that's your urge to move. Again, the urge to move being I don't know how you measure that exactly, but that's basically the thing that you're reporting here. So again, it's hard to measure. It's hard to get a handle on this directly, but so basically they have this stochastic decision model, the neural decision to move. Human subjects are able to comply with the instruction to produce spontaneous movements at seemingly random times when asked to do so. We propose that the brain uses the same machinery for decision making in this sort of task as it would in any decision making task, a threshold applied to the output of a neural accumulator. This possibility is supported by a recent study pointing to a common neural mechanism for voluntary and stimulus-driven actions. Decision-making tasks are typically modeled in terms of accumulation of evidence, and so they're applying that to this sort of neural accumulator model, where you're accumulating evidence, and in this case it's the form of some neural signal. Okay, so that's basically what you're doing here. And so this is some examples here of what's going on. This is the stochastic decision model. This reproduces the distribution of waiting times, as well as the characteristic shape and time course of the readiness potential. So in A, we have this visual depiction of the model. So you have the signal, you have samples. After a stochastic exponential transition period, which is in here, I think, determined by the ratio of urgency and leak parameters, the leaky accumulator generates noisy trajectories, which are these here, whose threshold crossings determine movement times. So it has to cross a certain threshold. It moves closer to the threshold, and it hits this threshold up here, and it hits it at different times. So you can see the noise kind of drives it away from the threshold and then back towards the threshold. And this kind of, there's this waiting time where you see this distributed across samples. And so, okay, so that's A. And the waiting time is the time from the trial onset to threshold crossing. And the readiness potential is the average over all the simulated epochs, time locked at the threshold crossing. So the readiness potential is somewhere in the middle. So it's like you generate a bunch of signals and you find the average of that signal, and that's the time. That's the actual readiness potential, basically. So the idea is that this is not like a deterministic process. This relies on, sort of spontaneous neural activity, and as such, we have to model this as a series of stochastic signals that are sort of averaged together, and that's how you end up with this readiness potential. Then B is the mean waiting time distribution, and we can look at this in terms of the model. We can also look at the empirical data, and we have this sort of over the number of trials over time. So you see this here. It measures a mean waiting time distribution. And then C is the mean empirical readiness potential from the classic Lebet task, and the mean sign reversed output of the simulation fit to the time range here. So again, we have our model, we have the empirical data, and so this is the empirical data from the Lebet task. This gray line, the black line, is the model, and it fits the model fairly closely. Okay, so that's basically the experiment. I'm going to go down to the discussion here, see if we can. All right, so the origin of self-initiated movement is a multifaceted question, and there are numerous different contexts in which spontaneous self-initiated movements may arise. The initiation of foraging or grooming behaviors, adjusting one's position after having been seated for a while, or even musical improvisation. So there are a lot of contexts for different types of movement. Our study concerns events in the brain near the end of the causal chain leading to self-initiated movement in the last 1 or 2 seconds before movement onset. In a context where single specific movements, where a movement is to be made spontaneously at an arbitrary unspecified time. Our model was intended to account for the shape of the pre-movement buildup in neural activity that is known to precede spontaneous self-initiated movements, and then 2, the distribution of waiting times observed in this context. And so there's a lot of sort of work that spanned more than 40 years examining the properties of the readiness potential, its temporal profile, its topography at different latencies, variability in different task contexts and disease states, potential cortical generators, given its relevance to free will. However, we still lack a precise mechanistic account of what the readiness potential reflects, beyond descriptive phrases such as planning and preparation for movement. So they basically, this is a term that people use, but it's not clear what it actually means, especially at the neural level. So, you can say it's planning and preparation, but what does that actually result in terms of the neural substrate? And so what they've done here is offered an account for what this actually means in terms of ongoing spontaneous fluctuations in neural activity, this neural accumulator threshold. It's both plausible and parsimonious. Our account departs from the prevailing assumptions about the nature of the readiness potential and thus suggests that some very basic questions be revisited from a different perspective. So, I think a lot of what they've done here is kind of confirm the Bay experimental model, but also provided, some pretty interesting mechanisms for how this occurs. And then, just to be kind of clear about this is both a cross-species phenomena, so you can use this model in a wide variety of animal contexts, from humans to crayfish. So, the neural substrate can differ, but the signal is basically generated in the same way or a similar way. And then we can actually, look in terms of brain-computer interfaces and how they make the point here. Our model might also help explain why the readiness potential is not proved to be a particularly robust predictor in the development of asynchronous brain-computer interfaces. So we can look at brain-computer interfaces to see an example of how this is not necessarily a predictive phenomenon, or as predictive as we'd like to think. We assume that spontaneous fluctuations are ongoing even when the subject is not preparing to move, and that these can often approach the threshold without crossing it. So you can get a lot of noise in, if you're looking at BCIs, and a lot of BCIs try to use this readiness potential as a proxy for movement. So if you're building a BCI for someone who is not able to move their arms, and you want to use it as a control signal, then you have to, if you make the assumption that it is a control signal, it needs to actually have some efficacy. I mean, you don't want to have the BCI trigger a movement or a movement signal when no movement signal was intended. So this is maybe kind of a problem in some of the design of BCIs. And understanding this process better will actually help us build, I guess in terms of asynchronous BCIs. I guess synchronous BCIs, that's not so much a problem. But in any case, it can help us do this a little bit better. So synchronous BCI applications use a priori knowledge at the time of the event by cueing the subject to form an intention. So there's an actual cue involved. So asynchronous BCIs don't have a cue, and they're just recording from the neural activity. So this is, this kind of uncovers what we're doing here, what we're dealing with. Okay, so this is an interesting paper, and it kind of gets into this whole sort of morass of literature on preparing to move and intentionality and, goal-directed movements and things like that. Now I want to get into this other paper, and I don't know how connected this is going to be, but we'll talk about this paper in terms of, how it links to the other paper, but really standing on its own. This is active inference and intentional behavior. This is a preprint that was released in late 2023. So I don't know if this has been published anywhere else, but I'll just go over the preprint. This is Friston is the main author. We have some active inference people here: Thomas Parr, Christopher Buckley, Maxwell Ramstead. So this is, kind of talking about intentional behavior and active inference. So the abstract reads, recent advances in theoretical biology suggest that basal cognition and sentient behavior are emergent properties of in vitro cell cultures and neuronal networks. So we're going to be talking about basal cognition, but mainly in the context of, things like Dishbrain and that type of thing, which we've talked about before. Such neural networks spontaneously learn structured behaviors in the absence of reward or reinforcement. So again, we have this, it's not the readiness potential, but it is this phenomena where you have the spontaneous learning of structured behaviors. There's no reward or reinforcement. In the example before, movements can be reinforced by behavior. So the intention to move can be reinforced by the previous behavior, or it can be reinforced by cues. But you also have situations where movements are generated spontaneously. And so in this case, what we see is we have these neuronal networks generating structured behaviors in the absence of a reward or reinforcement. So then these are in vitro cell cultures, so they're not connected to other sort of sources of information, basically. In this paper, we characterize this kind of self-organization through the lens of the free energy principle, and which is as self-evidencing. We do this by first discussing the definitions of reactive and sentient behavior in the setting of active inference, which describes the behavior of agents that model the consequences of their actions. We then introduce a formal account of intentional behavior that describes agents as driven by a preferred endpoint or goal in latent state spaces. We then investigate these forms of reactive, sentient, and intentional behavior using simulations. So the first thing they're going to do is simulate the aforementioned in vitro experiments in which neuronal cultures spontaneously learn to play Pong. This is the Dishbrain work, by implementing nested free energy minimizing processes. The simulations are then used to deconstruct the ensuing predicted behavior, leading to the distinction between merely reactive, sentient, and intentional behavior, with the latter formalized in terms of inductive planning. This distinction is further studied using simple machine learning benchmarks. So they do some other types of modeling, such as navigating in a grid world, and the Tower of Hanoi problem, which is stacking disks on a pole and making sure that they're in a certain order, that show how quickly and efficiently adaptive behavior emerges under an inductive form of active inference. So they kind of referenced Dishbrain at the beginning. In 2022, a paper was published that claimed to demonstrate sentient behavior in a neuronal culture grown in a dish. This is the in vitro neuronal network that they're talking about. The behavior in question was the spontaneous emergence of controlled movements of a paddle to hit a ball. So you have this movement, they used to play Pong, they used to have this dial, and it would move back and forth. They called it a paddle. And you would turn it back and forth to move the this sort of paddle that they had on the screen, and you'd have to match the ball's position in space. So you'd move the paddle right, left and right, and you would try to match the position of the ball when it came down to where the paddle should be. So it's a matter of predicting sort of where a ball should be. It's basically this intentional movement on one dimension where you're trying to match some stimulus, but not just match the stimulus where it is, predict where that stimulus will be when your movement is executed. So it's actually a little bit more complex than what we were talking about, the readiness potential, because there's a secondary component, which is the predictive component, predicting a trajectory. The study has several sources of inspiration that speak to the notion of basal cognition and related work. We talked about basal cognition in terms of Mike Levin's work and some of the related work on that. It's basically where you have very simple cognition, or the term basal being like, the common ancestor of all different forms of cognition. So you should expect certain types of behaviors, and that should transcend like humans and crayfish, as we saw in the last paper. Okay, so in particular, the hypothesis that adaptive and predictive behavior would emerge spontaneously was based on earlier work showing that in vitro neuronal cultures could be described as minimizing variational free energy. And thereby evince active inference and learning. This application of the free energy principle to neuronal cultures was subsequently validated empirically, in the sense that changes in neuronal activity and synaptic efficacy, and this underwrites learning, can be predicted quantitatively as a variational free energy minimizing process. So are these findings remarkable, or were they predictable? So then they consider, in one sense, they were entirely predictable. They were predictable from the free energy principle, which states that any two networks that are coupled in a certain sparse fashion will come to manifest a generalized synchrony. So basically, two networks will match each other when they are under the constraints of the free energy principle, if they're coupled. So they have to be coupled in some way. More formally, the FEP states that if the probability density that underwrites the dynamics of coupled random dynamical systems contains a Markov blanket, which shields internal states from external states, so it serves as sort of this boundary between internal and external states. It shields internal states from the activities of external states, given the blanket states, or sensory and active states. Then internal states will look as if they track the statistics of external states, or more precisely, as if they encode the parameters of a variational density at external states beyond that blanket. So basically, this is talking about, like, if we think about like the brain and cognition, we have these internal states, and then we have the external stimuli, we have the external states. And it depends on where the Markov blanket, what it covers, that determines what gets synchronized here. So empirically, this synchronization was observed when the neuronal cultures learned to play Pong. However, the FEP goes further and says that the internal and active states, or autonomous states of either network, can be described as minimizing a variational free energy function. On this reading, one can interpret the autonomous states of a network, particle, or person as minimizing variational free energy, or surprise, which is self-information, or equivalently maximizing Bayesian model evidence, the marginal likelihood of sensory states. This leads to an implicit teleology, in the sense that one can describe self-organization in terms of self-evidencing that entails active inference and learning, planning, purpose, intentions, and perhaps sentience. The underlying free energy principle minimizing processes, their teleological interpretation is the focus for this paper. So there are a lot of words there. And it's fine, but it's like, basically, if you are very familiar with this process, maybe you can intuit this better. But basically, you have to think about what kinds of things are involved in minimizing. So they're basically reinterpreting what we were talking about with respect to the readiness potential in the brain, is having this common framework of minimizing free energy. And so if you think about, like, whether I have a stimulus or not to prepare for a movement, there's a minimization of free energy that sort of biases a stochastic process to produce a movement at certain times over others. And so that kind of preference, I guess it's an energetic preference, then translates into this sort of teleological imperative, or this goal-directed imperative. the goal at one level being energy minimization. At another level, it's producing, movements that are efficient, and they're all kind of linked together in that framework. And then, of course, you can also, look at Bayesian model evidence, the likelihood of sensory states, and those things kind of fit together in a certain way. So, this is just kind of extending, in a way, what we saw in the last paper to this model of Dishbrain and sort of an interpretation in terms of free energy and variational free energy. The results reported in one work, which is this, I guess the Dishbrain paper, were considered by some to be unremarkable for a different reason. Learning to play Atari games like Pong was something that had been accomplished with machine learning systems years earlier using neural networks and reinforcement learning. So what is remarkable about a neural network reproducing the same kind of behavior? It is remarkable because one cannot use the reinforcement learning paradigm to explain the emergence of self-evidencing behavior seen in vitro. And by self-evidencing behavior, I guess they mean like this sort of adaptive behavior. Basically, you can't necessarily explain this reinforcement learning alone, is their point. This follows from the fact that one cannot reward a neuronal network because no one, in neuronal network meaning this in vitro network, not necessarily a neural network, you can't reward a neuronal network because no one knows what any given in vitro neuronal network finds rewarding. So at the level of a network, you can't provide a reward to it to improve its performance. That's not the currency of that network. For a neural network, an artificial neural network, you can reward that network if you know kind of the maybe the training data, or in a reinforcement learning model, of course, you can reward things based on the reward structure. Those things are sort of descriptive. But in the case of a network of neurons in a dish, you can't necessarily reward it because you don't know the currency. And so, but in the case of free energy, we kind of know what a network finds aversive, which is surprise and unpredictability. So we can use that as sort of a way, as sort of an anti-reward. And so this was the rationale for delivering unpredictable noise to the sensory electrodes of the cell culture, or restarting the game of Pong in an unpredictable way whenever the neuronal network failed to hit the ball. And so this is sort of a way that we could, sort of address this issue of reward and sort of recapitulate this in the neuronal network. Some found that the results reported in one remarkable, but not in a good way. And I like that because sometimes things are remarkable, but you don't know what the remarks are. Sometimes they're bad remarks. So, but in this case, yes, this was a bunch of bad remarks. They disagreed with the claim that the behavior could be described as sentient. So again, we talked about Dishbrain and I talked about sentience and this concept of sentience. And what they're doing here is unpacking sentience a little bit in terms of the free energy principle. So here we hope to make sense of the notion of sentient behavior in terms of Bayesian belief updating, where sentient behavior denotes the capacity to generate appropriate responses to sensory perturbation as opposed to merely reactive behavior. So the goal here, and the definition that they're working with in terms of sentience, is taking something that is, maybe like in vitro network that generates these sort of stochastic responses to things, and seeing how much they can generate appropriate responses to sensory perturbations. It's not just about optimization, it's about responding to perturbations. And the idea is that it shouldn't necessarily be reactive. It should be a little bit more complicated. And so, Pong playing behavior, I guess it's considered sentient as opposed to reactive. We consider a bright line between actions based upon the predictions of a generative model that does and does not entail the consequences of action. So it's the consequences of action, and then having these three different types of behavior: reactive, sentient, and intentional. Sentient falling between reactive behaviors and intentional behaviors. So this is where, kind of they go into a little bit about how, people have used model-free reinforcement learning as an alternative to active inference, and kind of going through that. This form of sentient behavior, described in terms of Bayesian mechanics, can be augmented with intended endpoints or goals. This leads to a novel kind of sentient behavior that not only predicts the consequences of its actions, but is also able to select them to reach a goal state that may be many steps in the future. So this is actually intentional behavior, which requires some form of backwards induction and, kind of this sort of thing that we talked about with, readiness potentials. Are we generating stochastic behavior or intentional behavior to generate movements, and what is the substrate of that? So definitely an interesting paper. There's a lot of jargon in here that's related to the free energy principle and to active inference. So I'm not going to dive deeply into that, but I do want to point out that this is really, kind of thinking about these different generated behaviors in different ways. So if we want to look at the definitions of reactive, sentient, and intentional behavior, reactive behavior is really characterized as the sensory motor reflex arcs and the mere realization of set points and trajectories. So this is where we have very simple homeostasis. In sentient behavior, we have sort of this influence of perception on action is mediated by the results of planning, with a distribution of our policies derived from a model endowed with counterfactual depth, or a belief about this future sensory consequences of actions. And then intentional behavior is not simply driven by a generic imperative to minimize sensory predictive error, but towards the attainment of a particular future endpoint or goal state. So this might be considered more complex homeostasis. So these are the ways that they define these behaviors. And then they think about active inference. And so we introduce the generative model used for the following sections, which can be seen as a generalization of a partially observed Markov decision process, or POMDP. And so this is model that we can use for looking at these kinds of behaviors. So this is the figure here, and they kind of model reactive, sentient, and intentional behaviors under these different types of reactive behavior. You can model this with Q-learning, and they show this controls inference, and this is equivalent to active inference for MDPs, or Markov decision processes. For sentient behaviors, you have action selection based on the inferred consequences of action. Intentional behaviors, action selection constrained by intended endpoints or goals. You have functions for each of these, and they vary by, we have a Q-learning component, reactive behavior. We have some variation on the noise signal here, or the variation signal here in sentient behavior, G, and then for intentional behavior, we have G and H on the same signal. And so we should have this expected free energy for partially observed Markov decision processes here, where we have two components, risk and ambiguity. So that's kind of how they formulate that. So those are those two papers. I don't exactly know how much more they connect. I think, with some of the things we talked about with the first paper, I think they map to some of the things in the second paper, especially since in the first paper they're trying to do these behavioral experiments where it's hard to define kind of the parameters of the experiment. You're dealing with human self-reports. You're dealing with different paradigms of figuring out what this readiness potential is doing, and then how that relates to, intended movement. So you have this aspect of intentionality, And then the second paper, they modeled this with this Dishbrain paradigm, where they look at an in vitro network. So they're just taking the measurements of electrophysiology, and they're modeling it with, the active inference paradigm, and looking at the variational free energy. So I don't know if people have looked at the readiness potential of variational free energy or not, but I think there's an important parallel there. Okay. Morgan, did you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure about the. Man, I love the connection. I mean, there is a connection. In terms of readiness potential, I'm not sure. Sorry, now that I'm talking, my dogs decided to jump on me. And it's interesting that they, in the second paper, that they're using Dishbrain, or talking about Dishbrain. I mean, this sounds like a great thing to bring to an experimental setup like that. I mean, I was actually thinking more, or some about the connections between the Ludobots and the second paper.
Oh yeah.
Or just in terms of these paradigms being very easy. Yeah, I mean, so that they brought it to a partially observed Markov decision process. Versus comparing that to some of the things that they're doing with Ludobots. I don't know. Maybe it's missing some of the neural stuff, but certainly easy to. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there.
Maybe my brain's not fully online yet, but anyway, the love that. Love thinking about. I've been trying to take to heart some criticism of free energy principle as a basically, when does it become a kind of falsifiable or comparable mechanism in a and what would you be comparing it against? And when is it more than just variational inference? I mean, I'm trying to get ready for January 21st. We're gonna do a textbook reading. So the active inference textbook.
Okay.
And that's part of the San Francisco Cognitive Science Reading Group, which is the one that did last project was Breitenberg vehicles.
Okay.
Or vehicles. Yeah. So it was a great discussion, or and it was hard not to think of that. I mean, when you were describing Ludobots, I was getting flashes of vehicles.
Yeah.
Or particular sections of vehicles, because I was just like, oh, this is just like, I forget, like, chapter 5 or whatever. Like, I forget exactly, but you know what I mean? Like, I was just getting flashes of that. Like, this is exactly Breitenberg's thought experiment of doing this with the robots.
Yeah.
and just how one, like, yeah, and well, just how much Bungard is conceptual, computationally realizing brain merge vehicles.
Yeah.
And anyway, so that was the group, and then like looking to the Active Inference Institute and some things Daniel Friedman's put out recently, getting together the materials, etc., for the next cohort textbook reading group. So they read it over multiple weeks, right?
Right.
But anyway, in preparation and also talking with this student who's interested in both brain imaging and computational psychiatry, just covering some of the Ryan Smith step-by-step tutorial, which is both a great paper that he explicitly made for those trying to break into both like computational psychiatry, trying to break into the active inference research area, and feeling like there was no good one-stop place for a beginner, and how he puts it in context of existing model-based RL research and kind of terminology. And so that's also interesting, just because when you look at a lot of robotics modeling and again, like kind of the rise of RL in so many of quote AI areas, right, where it's like it's either gameplay or it's robotic control, and it's very much been around model-based RL,
Right.
or related areas, right? And looking at the Ludobots, it'd be really interesting to see like what I see he's using PyBullet. Like what does say Dart, what additional frameworks or libraries would Dart bring in, which is another package that's like an extra layer on top of PyBullet. I think, I don't want to say necessarily co-developed, but from kind of robotics groups at Georgia Tech and related institutions. I think it'd be really interesting to look at both kind of like neuronal culture experiments, which obviously, this is really interesting because I'd love to bring something to, we got a lot of new possibilities with the Berkeley, Neurotech at Berkeley students who really want to do something Dishbrain. Cortical Labs has a new paper together with the brain engineers at UCSC.
Yeah.
And they're definitely trying to do something that is like, use our API, use us remotely. I'm sure that they're also trying to build out their own API just in terms of how to use one of their boxes, right? But anyway, just giving me some things to think about in terms of, what if you were going to do Dishbrain again, how would you use it?
Right.
And in kind of in a sense, like, what's the research topic when you're doing Dishbrain experiments?
Right.
You know? And it's and there's a couple of ways to look at that, and anyway,
Okay.
those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's
sorry, somewhat rambly because of my cold here.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, I think there's a lot to think about there, and especially at Dishbrain.
Yeah.
It's like, it's kind of like a black box right now, and figure out how to interpret what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it a lot like, I mean, again, like OpenAI back when they were a research company, the research/educational company.
Yeah.
All the way back in like what 2017.
Mm-hmm.
They had a thing called like spinning up an RL or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, it was their educational materials / platform, and but just part of it being like having a game engine to control the sensory input, and to have RL to control the agents agents actions and policies.
Yeah.
And just looking at some of the active inference. Yeah. I mean, one of the things Ryan Smith talked about, like, is that you can kind of dumb down active inference and put it in this kind of variational. Let's just predict a coin toss kind of, or let's predict the bias of a coin from coin tosses. But you're losing some of the active there, in the sense that that this isn't an agent exploring an environment.
Yeah.
This is you've abstracted so much away that it's somewhat collapsed down to just traditional probabilistic Bayesian inference, right?
Right.
And that maybe if you really want to have exploration and exploitation kind of trade-offs, that you need to put an agent into an environment, a more complex environment like that.
Right.
Anyway, it's just yeah.
All right.
Stuff.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for attending.
No, it's 9:30.
Yeah, it's fine.
For sure.
Yeah, so thanks for attending. And yeah, there's a lot of food for thought here. I think it's a good start to the new year. So let's continue to think about some of these outstanding issues about, GSOC, and about submissions, and about what we want to do with things. So, all right.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Take care, brother.
Take care. See you next week. Thanks.
Bye.